It takes a brave and independent mindset to go tiny. If you are trying to figure out your tiny pivot, this podcast is here to inspire and connect you with the other unconventional, gritty, inspirational people within this community. I am Laura Lynch, your tiny house friend and host. On this show, we are always going to come back to money because as a financial planner, this is the question I hear the most. How do I make this work for me financially? Well, that's my jam, so jump in, let's go. New episodes drop every Thursday.
Hey there, tiny house friends, Laura here. I wanted to give you a little preview into my conversation in episode 77 with Quentin Wilson. You know, one of the things that we have been doing in our tiny infrastructure project is make use of a building that we originally built as maybe a potential shop, workshop, that now is going to be repurposed into a studio greenhouse, a place for me to work and to hopefully grow food and make use of the beautiful solar energy that we have here in northern New Mexico. And so in researching for this project, I came across the podcast Mud Talks, which is a podcast that shares the basic building steps for building an Adobe. So here in northern New Mexico, Adobe construction is very common. You see it a lot. And if it's not actual Adobe, the frame construction is made to look like Adobe. So it's a very traditional building practice here and a way that the building actually blends in with the earth and the environment. And I became really fascinated with Adobe and I'm excited to get started with an Adobe project. So in learning about Adobe, I learned a great deal of many of the beautiful aspects of this building style. And I wanted to bring this to you, particularly because this is another DIY option. So Adobe construction has been traditionally built by the people who lived in the homes, and it is very accessible, as Quentin Wilson will explain in this episode. So we talk about Adobe, we talk about it, the benefits, we talk about some of the basic building elements, we talk about building codes. And Quentin, I was super excited to get time with because he's essentially an international expert on Adobe building. And so just to have been able to record his voice and his wisdom, he's now mostly retired, but still leads the conversation with even government officials about what happens with the Adobe construction trade, what happens after fire that occurred here in New Mexico. So it was great to be able to actually visit him at his home, get to see his own Adobe home, get to spend time with him and explore a full range of topics on Adobe. So if you're new to Adobe construction, I hope this will spark some curiosity in you about this as a building type. And if you're considering ways in which you could build your own home, this is one that I wanted to make sure that you knew about. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Quentin Wilson about Adobe construction.
Okay, I'm Quentin Wilson.
Yes.
And my wife and I, Maria and I, bought this rundown house in 1970. It had been unoccupied for 10 years. And some windows were missing and a couple of doors were missing, but otherwise we had enough to work with that we could make it livable within a couple of days and camped out in it. And that was 1970, which happens to be 54 years ago. So we've been working on this house. It's probably 80% done on its third renovation. We raised 3 children here. And now with the 3 children, we have 6 grandchildren who come here from time to time. Our son, Martin, will be here in the middle of December until the middle of January, and he and his family live in Madrid, Spain. At any rate, it's been a work in progress. We bought the house and the land very cheaply. It came up here to teach high school at Mesa Vista High School, which is just right out here in our front yard. I could walk to work. Life was simple, sort of. I was not a good fit to be a math teacher for high school students. It was discovered within 2 years. And so shortly after that, with the house being Adobe, there was only one person I could turn to for advice, and that was Mrs. Pacheco down the road. And she had done a lot of the work on her own home. And traditionally, men build the walls and women do the plastering and the maintenance. And that was the case with Mrs. Pacheco. And so she would tell me where to find things in the area, to find good dirt to make Adobe bricks, and where to find good dirt that would make a nice plaster. So that's not my first encounter with Adobe. I started out at age 10 in Albuquerque, South Valley of Albuquerque. We moved there from Kansas, my parents and I, in I think it was 1953. And I was 10 years old, and that's the 5th grade. And traditionally across the United States, teachers have kids make models of houses and forts and all kinds of things out of toothpicks and popsicle sticks and tongue depressors. And there were 2 men when we would come down Sunset Road in the South Valley of Albuquerque to head to our street, which was Denison. There were 2 men and a horse, and they would be visible sometimes coming home on the bus or riding my bike in this muddy patch that was between the pavement and the ditch, where they had cut the ditch water in. And they would go back and forth walking barefoot, and they had a horse to help out. And this was how they mixed mud to make Adobe bricks. So that was imprinted on me at that early age. And so when it came time in the 5th grade, my teacher was Mrs. Gay, and followed by in the 6th grade by Mrs. Jackson. So I continued this into the 6th grade. So I was making model houses out of little bitty Adobes. And I would bake them. I didn't sun cure them. I would bake them in my mother's oven. She wasn't too excited about that, but she didn't complain. She was always supportive. I was an only child. And so I got lots of support for all kinds of things that I might have done at that kind of an age. And so that's where Adobe was really imprinted on me. And we lived in a concrete block house, CMU, concrete masonry units. And most of the houses up and down our street were built like that. The contractor built himself a house that was right across the street from us. But the streets running behind us and in front of us and all around it were the traditional dwellings of people who had first come into the valley, and largely Hispanic. And so they were Adobe homes, and it was the perfect kind of a place to make Adobe. And there were everything there encouraged people to build out of Adobe because the dirt was there. The Rio Grande River flowed through, and the Sandia Mountains with any kind of trees and lumber were at a good distance. And so in the early days, Adobe was the obvious and natural choice. It was just right there. You can, as I've often said, it's hard to find a place anywhere in New Mexico that you can't make an Adobe brick. And it might not be right on the surface. You might have to dig down a foot or 2 or 3 or 6. We found one time in Tierra Amarilla, we were having a very tough time. We did a job up there with quite a bit of mud plaster. We were having a tough time finding appropriate soil. And after we got through that, I was up there one day, and they were digging for a septic tank that they put in, and there was the perfect dirt 6 feet down. So in Tierra Amarilla, before there were backhoes, it would have been known to the grave diggers. They would have gotten down 6 feet. And first of all, they would have found that it was warm on a cold winter day. If they were engaged in creating a grave, they would find that it was warm and fairly easy digging. And they'd probably be able to make a few extra Adobes out of the mound of dirt that came out. By the time I was 13, I was making full-sized Adobes in the backyard. And my father wasn't too happy with that because it was making a mess out of the back yard. I was doing these on the lawn. But then after a while, he decided once I'd ruined the lawn, he didn't have to mow the lawn. So he calmed down and again was supportive. So we had an irrigation ditch in the back of our house, the lateral that ran from the main ditch along Sunset Road. So I had a water supply, and we had mud in the backyard. And so that's my basic introduction.
That's amazing. So you basically grew up with Adobe, and then you've kind of always lived in an Adobe home?
Well, the home on Denison that we were in for 10 years was concrete masonry unit. So it wasn't Adobe, but it was all around us. And then I met Maria when I was 17. And her father was a medical doctor, and he had an office on South 4th Street in Albuquerque. And he built that during the World War II years. And the government inspectors came over to see what he was doing because he didn't have a permit everything was rationed. And then they discovered he was working with Adobe, and they didn't have that on their list. And they decided it couldn't be used for bombers or battleships or any war material. Mm-hmm. And so he was allowed to finish building his office. I'm not sure of the timing, but the house, which was a little further down the valley, in a fairly large house, probably close to 2,000 square feet, which was considered large in those days. Mm-hmm. And that was Adobe, and a very substantial home. So, and that house still exists. My mother-in-law lived in it till about 8 years ago, and then she passed away, and people bought it. And so first of all, Maria had been born before they moved into the house on LaFont. They were living in the office, the back side of the office. So Maria's full lifetime has been spent in Adobe houses. So she's actually more experienced than I am.
That's amazing. So it seems like that Adobe is really born out of necessity in terms of what materials were available and what was accessible to people when they were trying to build their homes. And yet you're still out teaching it as a modern technique, and especially for the DIY builder. So why do you think that it is applicable in modern times, and especially for folks that want to build their own home?
Well, it's accessible. And in this state, as I say, New Mexico was almost automatic Adobe, particularly up and down the river valleys, where we get the combinations of primarily clay. We'd like to see 30% clay, and sand. We'd like to see 70% sand, and silt, which we'd prefer wasn't there, but when it's there, we can live with it, and organic materials. Mm-hmm. So the materials are there, and anybody can take what there is on the ground and turn it into an Adobe brick, sun-cured Adobe brick. And many of us did that as children, and we may have been just making mud pies, but it's the same technique. It's as simple as children, or it goes through the ages. Children aren't simple. Oh, my grandkids have proved that. Anyway, it's something that children can handle at any age, and they just naturally take a bit of water and a bit of dirt and turn it into mud and make mud pies. So that is the very same technique that we're using to make Adobe bricks. We just make them a little bigger, and usually we make them in a form to get rectilinear bricks. I would point out that the women in Dejene, Mali, go down to the river as the Niger River recedes after the rainy season. They go with their kids, and they just pick up handfuls of mud, and then they pat it into a brick shape so that it's rectilinear. And then they just leave it. And then once it's dry, they go back and they take them home, the bricks, and they can turn those into an addition, either an outside wall or another room, or sometimes they break up the bricks and use it to make plaster, to replaster the houses. So for whatever reason, the men just haven't noticed that they should keep women out of the building trades in the Adobe area. And as you mentioned, there were quite a few very successful women builders. And so it was never tied up in trades or guilds. Nobody ever asked somebody for a mason's card, or you didn't have to prove that you were a journeyman. You could just go ahead and build. Mm-hmm. But so I would say, first of all, Adobe and the materials to make it are just everywhere on the planet. People are very successful Adobe builders in Kansas. The Mennonites in the town of Hillsboro and its surrounding areas build a lot with Adobe. And the Mennonites operate somewhat like the Amish do, in a very well-known technique of putting up big barns out of timber structures in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Well, the Mennonites do this in Kansas, except that they put together Adobe homes. And everybody gets together and they make Adobes, and then they build these homes. They're either single story with half of the dwelling for animals and half for the people, or sometimes the people are upstairs, not next to the animals, but upstairs. And we see that a lot in Europe. Mm-hmm. So there's Kansas. And the further west you go in Kansas, the more it was prairie. It wasn't forest. So what people did there was build with sod. Mm-hmm. And in Spanish, that's terrón. And so both in the valleys of New Mexico rivers, we find terron. There's a lot of it around Albuquerque and south of Albuquerque. Isleta Pueblo is largely built with terron. So first of all, it's accessible. There's nobody out there saying you can't build with Adobe until modern times, at least, when they start talking about having permits and meeting the code. But women have been very successful when, let's say in the early 70s, two women wrote the greatest handbook ever, How to Keep the Mud Out. No, How to Keep the Rain Out with Just Plain Mud. That's the subtitle. It's Adobe Notes. It's a little pamphlet, 30 pages long. Mostly it's linoleum cut to make images. And it's all anybody ever needs to build a house. It gives you all the guidelines. And they do point out that in the Spanish tradition, you didn't put flowers and other plants right up against the house. You kept them at some distance near the well. And my own house, the plants keep creeping closer and closer to the walls. And sometimes I pay the price for that by having Adobe structures get a little bit damp. Nice thing about Adobe structures that get damp, they dry out. And Maria and I were just looking recently at a frame wall that had gotten wet. And with frame walls, if you don't deal with it quickly, the moisture goes up between the inside and the outside, the sheetrock and maybe the plaster outside, but it goes in there, it gets into the fiberglass insulation. And if you can't, then the only thing you can do really is remove the interior sheetrock and dry it out. But we see this across the country when there are flood conditions. It's really devastating for an Adobe house. It's really devastating for a frame house. Whereas some of the places where you can make comparisons is Hatch is one place, and they were flooded maybe 15 years ago. And strangely enough, the Adobe houses survived, and they were in standing water for maybe 3 days. And I would not have thought they would have survived, but I went down. There was some legal activity, and one of the lawyers called me down to look at this house. And so it was amazing how the Adobe had survived a flood. I don't know that it would have gone on for much more than 3 or 5 days. At some point, the moisture would have moved through and we would have had compression failure. It would have turned back to mud and the house would have come down a couple inches. And that has happened. Back to Albuquerque growing up, we would have catastrophic floods almost yearly. And it was courtesy of the dikes that were put in by the Army Corps of Engineers. And we'd have these flash floods coming down off of the Sandias or coming down off of the West Mesa. And the dikes were supposed to contain the Rio Grande River when it flooded, but it was more often that the other side flooded. And so we had water piling up against the dikes, and particularly the Barelas area of Albuquerque. It was common on television to see people sitting on their couches with water flowing in one door and out the other. Often as not, that would only last for a day or 2 or 3, and then the water was gone and the houses would survive.
So does Adobe push water out in the way that concrete does? Does it help, just sort of push the water out of the earth? Is that why they survive, or why they can dry out in comparison to a drywall?
I think it's just because the water doesn't penetrate far enough. If whatever gets wet pretty shortly, once it's wet, it's mud. And it may have enough strength that it'll stand in place, but at some point it starts to slough off. Concrete has a very high capillary action, high capillarity. It will wick moisture all over the place. Concrete will. And even more so is pumice or pumice-crete blocks or loose pumice for insulation, which we had loose pumice for insulation on the sun dwellings at Ghost Ranch. 2 walls, a 14-inch wall, a space 10 inches, and another 10-inch wall with the 10-inch space filled with pumice. And the 4 sun dwellings, 2 of them had their back walls come off because they picked up moisture. We built them with the high roof on the south, sloping down to the north. And then unfortunately, all of the rain and all of the snow got deposited on the north side, which was not good. And some of that moisture migrated through and got to the pumice. Well, pumice is just outrageously capillary action device, and concrete is less so. And Adobe usually doesn't support capillary action very well. Moisture will move through it, but it's going to move much more slowly than cement, or I should say concrete. and such things as pumice and maybe vermiculite. There are several, besides vermiculite, there are a couple of other ites out there that people have used for insulation. And so anyway, you just have to make sure anytime that you use those materials that they are really well isolated from the foundation, and you've got to maintain the slope away from the back of the building, and then that's when we begin to get the buildings that are going to last for centuries or millennia. Let me just go back before I was rambling there, back to the women. So started with the Adobe Notes handbook, and I never figured out that one of them was DNS. Well, that was Dorothy N. Stewart, and she was a crusty character who is in Santa Fe and built houses for a lot of the women who came out and had ranches. The point is that there were women builders, contractors. Some of them specialized in greenhouses, but many of them worked with Adobe. So the observation that women were highly involved in Adobe construction is true. Sometimes on the entire building traditionally, whether it's Native American or Hispanic, or many cultures around the world, the men put up the walls, and then the women plaster them and maintain the house. And so that means that in parts of the world, the men can be out leaning against the wall on the sunny side in the winter and on the shady side in the summer, discussing philosophy and world events, all the important things, while the women do the easy work of plastering and running wheelbarrows around and getting bricks up on the wall. So all of these years, since 1970, since I've been paying attention, it's been very easy for a woman to get into Adobe construction. And well, one of my heroes would be Pat Martinez Rutherford of Taos. And that woman, with her first husband, Mario Balestri, they started the a rammed earth company, Soledad Canyon Builders. This woman built 75 houses. I only built 25. I consider that a career. And she was involved with 75 houses over the years. She was also president of the New Mexico Association of Home Builders at one point. And she's now with her second husband. Mario passed away a good number of years ago. And Wayne Rutherford, who's a home builder, and they are in Taos. So there would be a shining example of what a woman could do, both in terms of getting houses built, and then in the kind of the, whatever we would call it, the guild side of things, being with the New Mexico Association of Home Builders. So anyway, that's across the spectrum. I can't say there are no barriers to women. Many conversations, women have still found men who don't get it. And probably anywhere you went, you might be building a house and you might be a contractor, and they'd probably ask your husband, Eric, if you have his permission to do what. So all I can say is, on behalf of the men who haven't caught on yet, I apologize. But the state of New Mexico still, I think, is essentially wide open to women builders.
So Quentin, you mentioned building codes earlier, just briefly. And so I want to get into a little bit of, I know you're like an expert on, building code related to Adobe. So is Adobe broadly in the International Residential Code, or is it only in like New Mexico's building code specifically?
Well, that's a good question. We'll try to limit that to 3 or 4 days. The way the codes start out, people were just building, and it was people just paying attention to what other people did throughout history, across the globe, worldwide. If you'd be around somebody, and if he weren't listening to the grandparents, or if he was the grandparent and he was the first one doing it, if people underbuilt, things fell apart. And otherwise, people would just do what they had seen the grandfathers and the uncles and the aunts and the grandmothers do if they were successful. And that's a fine way to decide what size vigas you should have, how wide and thick your adobes should be, all kinds of things, just simply looking at what's been done in your neighborhood. And this is true of all kinds of construction in the U.S. And somewhere along the way, and I know in the early 1800s, they were actually having building codes. I believe the White House burned, maybe this was in 1812, the war with the British, they burned the White House. a couple of things that they learned when the White House burned, mainly that is the timbers in the middle of timbers, they burned, and then the timbers went down and they levered up the masonry walls that the White House had been built with. And so the walls were tipped over by these levers. So that's when we learned to put a fire cut in. So on big joists and beams, you'd put a cut on that's at an angle, and that way it can fall in the case of a fire. I better get good at this because I'm trying to be talking to some of these people involved in what happens to adobes in fires. But at any rate, it all got to New Mexico, and I would say around the end of these maybe the early 60s, the city of Albuquerque decided they should have a code. Mm-hmm. And they hired P.G. McHenry, Paul Graham McHenry, known as Buzz McHenry, and he was sort of one of my mentors, and he was the grand old man of Adobe in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. Well, he wrote the code, and it was a page and a half, and that was Albuquerque's code. Then the state of New Mexico, somewhere along the way, decided that they should have a code. In this state, municipalities or counties can have their own building codes. If they don't have a code, then it falls in the rural areas. It falls in the laps of the state, and you get a permit once somewhere in the 60s. The state says everybody has to have a permit to build, no exceptions. So then there was all of the decision making going on who would administrate these things. So, for instance, where I am right now, there is no town. Caliente is just a populated valley of adobe houses, and so we deal with the state. I have to go to Santa Fe to get a building permit. And several counties, Taos County has its own code, and the county and the Santa Fe have different codes. And by and large, what everybody did was they adopted and adapted Albuquerque's code. But some people got really carried away and added things to it. And for many years in the electrical code, National Electrical Code, they just said unfired masonry. And people said, what do they mean by that? Well, it's one way of describing Adobe. Finally, somewhere in about 1976, unless it was 86, in the electrical code, they used the word Adobe. So it's very clear. It says Adobe, and there it is. It lays it out. So there's no, we all know, most of us know what Adobe means. So then, somewhere along the way, and it was decided that we ought to get Adobe into the International Building Code. Mm-hmm. And so there was an effort that got started with myself and P.G. McHenry and David Eisenberg from Tucson. And that didn't quite get going. What happened was that then all of a sudden the Adobe code just sprung up. And what happened is that there was the idea was to get Adobe into the ASTM, American Standard Testing Materials. Mm-hmm. And they thought, okay, get it into ASTM, because much of what we find in the code refers to ASTM testing. That was written by Bruce King, an architect engineer person in California who has written a number of things. But once it was in ASTM, then you could go to the regular code people and say, well, look, we just refer to this. And so then the code picked up. When I say the code, I'm speaking now of the International Building and Residential Codes. They picked it up. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, New Mexico's code, the New Mexico Earth and Building Materials Code, which was the offshoot of that one that McHenry started in Albuquerque, then the state came up with the code that started out page and a half. It's now like 30 pages. Mm-hmm. And we have only ourselves to blame for that because it's largely been written by people in the Adobe community. I think we've included compressed earth block and cob. I don't know quite how the cob people they have their own code system, but it might be in the state of New Mexico we've picked up cob. And I apologize that I'm not too precise on that, but I'm getting older, and the code is getting older, and as it gets older, it gets bigger, and as I get older, my capacity to remember gets smaller, so this isn't quite working out right. There's one of the best codes, oddly enough, is the city of Boulder, Colorado. Probably 4 people have used it in the last 20 years. Not a lot of people build in the city. Mm-hmm. We have friends who built out in the county. Right. So That's probably about all I'm going to say about the code. But there's always one other that's I should say. National Bureau of Standards has this wonderful thing, if you can find it, the technical note 996. That's been around probably since the 60s or the 70s. And then also since the 1930s in the Department of Labor, they have a category for Adobe masons. This was widely accepted. There were handbooks put out during the Depression on how to build with Adobe. The amazing one came out of Texas. They were becoming experts in earthen bases for road construction. Well, what they found out, and somebody pointed out, was that what makes good road base makes a good Adobe brick. So everything that they'd learned at Texas A&M about making road base works for Adobe. So in the end of the 30s, going into the 40s, they put out this wonderful handbook on buildings built with earth. And Lyle Wolfskill was the author, et al. There were about 3 authors. 2 of our major presenters at our conferences, let's say 10 years ago, Dr. Charles Graham was at Texas A&M. And there was another man, Richard Burt, was at Texas A&M. And they both had an interest in Adobe, and they went together and bought a compressed earth block making machine. One was an architect, one's an engineer. They had combined this thing. What they didn't know was that their very institution had been the flagship leader of information 30 years beforehand. And unfortunately, Dr. Graham has passed away, but he had gone on to be the Dean of Architecture at University of Oklahoma. So we just had people, knowledgeable points all over the country, spending a lot of good energy and time and good thoughts on Adobe. Probably almost the best of the codes come out of Australia and New Zealand. They have wonderful codes. And for whatever the case, I think with Australia, they have fewer elements that hold them back than we find here in the United States when it comes time to work with the code, create a new code, or modify a code. Okay, now I'm done with codes.
Awesome.
On Less House More Moola, we hear so many stories of people living unconventional lives. Each of them is literally building their alt-American dream. Are you tired of putting your dreams on hold because of money? Well, let's fix it. I have a 2-part offering that is here to help you. First, I'm going to give you access to my financial freedom calculator so that you'll understand your numbers and have a tangible starting point. This is free. And then second, we'll book a session to figure out your finances so that you can live your alt-American dream as soon as possible. This is paid. Why am I giving you something for free? Because I'm passionate about empowering people to choose an unconventional path. So let's work together to figure out money so that you will know that you've officially taken action on your plans. This offering is for you if you're unsure of your cost of living or how much savings you might need. You don't know what money move to make next. You dream of an unconventional life built on your terms. You're seeking a permanent solution and not a one-time motivational boost. You want to learn about money from someone who shares your interest in breaking away from the norm. So what do you think? Are you tired of starting sentences with someday when I? Then go to altamericandream.com and get the financial freedom calculator.
So it sounds like that Adobe has been recognized more broadly than some other sort of alternative building techniques that are out there. So it's good to know that people have guidance and that there's research to figure out how to actually do it well. And we touched on it a little bit with water, but I know fire is another really important benefit or thing about Adobe. I've talked to some neighbors who have Adobe homes. One of them had her Adobe garage burned down, and the Adobes were in perfect shape, and it was only the rafters, the wood parts that burned. So certainly more fire resistant, perhaps more flood resistant. What are all of the other benefits of Adobe?
Well, we still don't know yet about I'm dealing with some folks at FEMA, and they came across my internet connection yesterday from 2 different directions and trying to get some input from me on houses that were involved in the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon fires over, I call that the burn corridor. And yes, indeed, as you say, quite often the walls are left standing. They're not organized, but I have quite a few slides on this at this point. Like the White House, and one house in particular over by Mora, the adobes, they let go in the middle and dropped in, and that meant all of the adobes above that on the wall were levered over, and they fell in too. So the house has been cut back by about 2 feet. The dirt that went on the adobes and the dirt that went on above the level of the adobes and then also formed a parapet, all of that got levered in. A great story is a woman and her husband, and their last name is Love, in California, built themselves a book about the house that they built. At any rate, Stevie Love and her husband made their own adobe bricks, built themselves a home. It's a sizable home, and it's in Southern California. I believe it looks out over the Mojave, and it was hit by this incredible wildfire. And in their subdivision, something like 200 houses were lost, and their house was unscathed. I'm not going to claim that that was entirely due to its having been adobe. It may have been some luck. They could have been in a little area where the eddies and currents of the flame front just didn't quite get them. What did happen was that she had a metal storage building. She's an artist, and unbeknownst to me, maybe other people, the metal storage buildings, that these containers often have a wooden floor, and the fire went under it, and the wooden floor got fully involved, and so she lost a lot of the artwork that she had stored. So we have the example of a steel building right next to an adobe building, but maybe the adobe building wasn't subject to the same things. It's got a pitched roof, and now my house is a sitting duck. If a fire comes through, because, well, we've got all these places where we've got the overhanging eaves, and we've got the pitch roofs. We've got 9 dormers on this house, each one of which is just sitting there waiting for a flame to hit it and drive up and find some wood or something that'll burn. So we might have the walls left, but I would have a heck of a mess on my hands were this house to become fully involved in a fire. Mm-hmm. And so there's work on this young man, Michele Barbato, at University of California, Davis, is kind of becoming a focal point for information on how to make a house that doesn't burn. But we won't see those results for a while. They've done some laboratory tests. I've been out looking at the actual houses, and so at least you do get, well, right below me, my neighbor down here in the Comanche Canyon Arroyo, which just runs just the other side of my property line, his house burned, and you can just see where the vigas caved in as they burned. And quite often people had the traditional roof was a dirt roof, and that house may have had, my house was originally flat roofed and it had some dirt on it. So I put the big metal roof on it with all this wood framing. So I'm the one to blame that I've turned it into this sitting duck. So the old, simple adobe house, the warm, round, brown house that just has where the adobe plaster curves around to the windows and it doesn't expose very much wood. If you don't have vigas protruding, which a lot of people have, is protruding vigas. If you come up and have an adobe parapet, and then the top of the house, the roof of the house, is finished off with dirt, then you're highly protected. So the old-fashioned warm, round, brown adobe houses with dirt roofs and mud plaster, but then people like myself, it was an appropriate response to the weather we have up here. It snows. I had frost on my truck windshield today, and pretty soon it's going to be snow. And so people get tired of the warm, round, brown house with the flat roof. And under the right conditions, sometimes moisture percolates through the dirt and starts to drip inside. And then that's when the wife said, in our case, when the drip got to my side of the bed, then I said, oh, this is too much. And so we put the metal roof on. So now we're in great shape in terms of water defense, but we're not at all in great shape for fire defense. So I would also say, and in certain cases, this is realistic, and the U.S. government did prove it, and so did the Sandinistas, or else the Nicaraguan government. Adobe's bulletproof. And a standard 10-inch wall withstands up to about a 50 caliber. It takes a 50 caliber slug to penetrate an adobe wall. So for small arms fire, you're safe in an adobe house if you stay below the glass level. And that sort of sounds like it's off the wall and maybe tongue in cheek. But occasionally, I've 4 times in my life since I got out of the Army, I've had a bullet whistle pass me somewhere that I knew it was a bullet because I could hear it before I heard the gunshot. Well, anyway, Adobe is, and it's surprisingly vermin-proof. So it's fireproof, vermin-proof, soundproof. We don't hear a lot of exterior noises. They did an Adobe house next to let's say it was a frame house in Norman, Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma put two houses together to compare them. And they had to put in some sort of an electronic device because inside the Adobe house, you could not hear the alarms that went off, this town warning for tornadoes. It was so quiet. So they had to put in a little speaker in the house with a microphone outside. So soundproof is just proof of so many things. And
here we are sitting in your sunroom, right? Which brings in the whole idea of the passive heating and cooling that are possible through Adobe building technique.
That's right. The main thing about Adobe, its dominant feature is its mass. It's so heavy. And when I was building homes, an equivalent frame home might have been built to more or less the same pattern. And you could bring out all of the materials on a truck, a semi-truck, for somewhere around 50 tons of material. You could build a house. The same house built with Adobe is probably at the very least around 400 tons. But also I'm counting quite a bit of weight goes into the foundation and then the walls themselves. Strangely enough, the plaster inside and out is pretty heavy. And then Adobe houses often are using heavier beams. I should say, to be truthful, that there often are more board feet of lumber in an Adobe house than there are in the equivalent frame house. And that's because we've got large beams or vigas for the ceilings. Quite often the ceilings are wood. They're not sheetrock. Many times we may have a superstructure for the roof system that takes quite a bit of lumber. And then we have wooden lintels over the tops of doors and windows. And the bond beam that goes around the house that holds it together and spreads the load and just makes a nice unit. The bond beam I almost always did wood unless somebody really wouldn't go for it. We did one or two houses with concrete bond beams. But the bond beam is 6 inches in depth and 10 inches or more in width. There's a huge amount of board feet that goes into the bond beam. So we can't just say we're saving the forests. Anyway, I just would have to say that there's quite a bit of lumber in an Adobe house, and lumber weighs. I mean, it's there you go with 40 tons of lumber, maybe several truckloads, particularly working with vigas. These big round vigas are 600 pounds. Some of them are 800 pounds, even when they're dry.
So all that mass collects warmth.
Heat.
Right.
And so thank you. That got me going. As long as you have this mass, wood, strangely enough, has about the same specific heat as Adobe. They both are right around 0.2. I'm having to remember which system I'm in. 0.2 British thermal units are maintained in a pound of material when the temperature is raised 1 degree. 0.2 is the specific heat of Adobe and stone and concrete and wood. And there were monks at the monastery over in Pecos, New Mexico, and they sell lots of pamphlets. And so they have this huge warehouse full of tons of books, and that is their storage for their passive solar. So yeah, massive things hold heat, and Adobe is the champion of the massive materials.
Right. And so it releases that heat at night. So it collects it in the day when the sun is cast on it, if you have the right angles of your overhangs. And so it grabs that heat and then it releases slowly at night.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's the other reason that we choose Adobe is it's slow. And concrete would hold the same amount of heat, but it's fast. The transmissivity of heat in concrete, stone, brick is much faster. So the Adobe is sluggish. It just doesn't get going. And it takes about 10 to 12 hours to lose the heat that is built up. And so in our bedroom, for instance, this morning, I get up in the morning, it's usually a couple of degrees warmer inside the bedroom than it is at night. And so the transmission through the wall is taken about 10 to 12 hours. If it were stone or concrete, that transmission would take place probably in 2 to 4 hours. So that's where, yeah, Adobe is wonderful because it has a high specific heat, not compared to water. It's only 1/5 of water. Water is the thing the standard, and its specific heat is 1. And some people, so a lot of people went to water storage, and so then they had canisters and tanks and clear tubes full of water and fish in them. And Steve Baer did that with his zones in Albuquerque. He had water walls. He just had translucent 55-gallon drums on racks just right up against his windows. It worked perfectly fine with a little bit of extra tuning. And he would had at night he had a big drop down tailgate, as it were, would come up in clamshell and close it off at night. He did have to do that. If he left it down, then it lost too much heat radiating out. So the Adobe house takes care of that for you, because by the time the sun goes down, the heat's gotten past the halfway point, and it's going to keep going on into the house rather than turning around. And some of it does turn around and go out. So there are some thoroughgoing houses that have been done where people actually would have a way to close up the Adobe house, clamshell. Oh, and they did that at the monastery too. It was a clamshell system but they were much lower. I think what they did was under their big work tables, they had 55-gallon drums on the lower part of their glass facade, and they could work there. And then the upper part was direct gain sunlight. So it was a very well thought out system. I don't quite remember at the moment who designed and built that, but massive materials just work to your advantage. And so I would say, the main thing is that we call the planet Earth, and that's because the Earth is all around us and does all these wonderful things, and it's heavyweight and it doesn't burn and bulletproof. So anyway, enough of that.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, right? Is that you may not be able to save all the trees, right? But your home is going to be more efficient in terms of heating and cooling, so less energy usage, and then lasting longer, right? The homes can last a long time, right? Adobe homes can.
We think they'll outrun it's hard, having been back east and seen some of the old timber frame houses and even the early day stick built houses. They hold up. Well, people always say, well, what do we do about Adobe in a wet climate? Well, it's what we do with anything. You have to get your foundation up above the water level.
Right.
And then you can start your walls. And then you get to the top of the walls, you need a nice little cap on top of that to keep the rain off.
Sure. Well,
if Adobe has that, it has a good foundation and a good roof, it's going to last forever.
Yeah.
If it's frame, if it's wood construction, we have to do the same things to protect the house. Otherwise, we get rot, mildew, spores, everything else that goes along with long-term wetness.
Termites. Don't forget the termites.
Termites. I forgot termites. I've never seen one. This is an Adobe house, young lady. So, yeah, there was something out around Ocate, New Mexico, on the plains, kind of in the north central part of New Mexico. And around Ocate, there were things that were boring into Adobe, and I never knew if they were bees. I don't think they were termites, but we did see Adobe buildings with the Adobe bricks riddled with holes. So, and metal. Let's go back to metal too. If you build a house out of metal, and we're seeing people doing this, light gauge construction or big frame steel structures, they need to be protected from water at the bottom and at the top. And you need to do something to isolate most anything from concrete, because particularly wood, they want to see the bottom plate of a wood framed house either be pressure treated, or else it has to be cypress or redwood, or else it has to have some kind of a moisture barrier in there. So it's a universal concern, keeping our walls dry. And if we do that with Adobe, we're good for 300 years. We know that. And then the Chinese will pop up and say, pardon me, I think you meant 3,000. And then there'll be a couple people in North Africa and say, no, it's 6,000.
Oh, amazing. So what are a couple of success stories that you have seen over all of your years in terms of people coming into this, not knowing anything maybe about it, and getting educated through, the classes that you taught or the other ways that you have helped educate people over the years?
Have you seen people just come into this knowing nothing and build their own homes and do it at a good cost savings and help themselves and their families to have a good shelter?
Yes, a good example would be Tracy in Abiquiu.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually she might have taken some of the classes that I did early on, but she, by her own self, and she did hire people to help her, but she amazingly got herself a nice little Adobe house up,
Mm-hmm.
and then a studio garage. Well, and I would say that that's somebody I'm proud of, but she did it was her own true grit. And I would have to say, and endangering myself to say this, but I believe that over the years, more women who took my classes got houses built and completed than men did. And would you guys just get going, please? Thank you. So, so I would chalk that up as, and there are a few people, there are plenty of people. It surprises me that never took one of my classes. Can figure out how to get a house built. The thing is, it's so simple. There are 7 things. And when you look at a frame house, there are all these things you have to learn. There's barge rafters and there's other kinds of rafters. And is it a rafter? Is it a joist? And doing all this. Adobe is just the foundation. It's a wall, the bricks, and a little bit of mortar. And you have lintels. And you put a bond beam on the top of that and a roof deck and some dirt and you're done.
Yeah.
It's not that easy. It's an incredible amount of labor. And people do view Adobe as if it's very laborious. All construction is laborious. All construction can take a toll on a person's mental well-being, and on couples it can be a problem. Anyway, let's stick with Tracy for the moment as a success story, because there've been quite a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
And right now I'm working with some people in the Alcalde area, and it's just a family group, and they're going to build a family chapel. And I'm just tickled with that.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially none of them has experience. I'm going to help them a little when it comes time to start laying up the adobes, because there's several different ways that people can lay up adobes. Either build the corners first and run strings off of the corners, or put up the speed leads at each corner, the wooden speed leads, and put a string around and then build up to those strings. And so I help people with that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this family is, I don't, many times we see people and say, oh yeah, my grandfather did this, or my father.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that anybody in this particular family, Martinez / Sanchez, has, and I could be wrong, has that background experience, but I'm looking forward to seeing that go up. I have another man right now in South Valley of Albuquerque, and he's doing an addition for his daughter, and it's Adobe. And he sends me, and he never took a class, and maybe he's read up on things, but he had a house here in Ojo Caliente many years ago that he turned into a solar Adobe with a greenhouse on it. And so he's building, and he's got the Adobes up in a phenomenal amount of days. Every time he's going up 2 or 3, maybe 5 courses a day. And so just to say that it is hard work. Everybody can do it. The really hard work, which is putting up the walls, laying up the adobes, it lasts about 3 weeks. And then you're on to other things. And so there was one young man, and he's just started an adobe making company up north of Taos. And Keaton Carvis is his name. And he was teaching adobe at a school, part of the Taos school system. So he had high school students he was teaching adobe. And he said, the problem, and he's the first person that got certified by the Earth Builders Guild as a certified Adobe Mason. He was our first one. And he says, the trouble with Adobe, he says, I love laying Adobe bricks. And then you're done, and you've got all the other stuff you've got to do. And he said he was kind of disappointed. So as you may know, our big supplier of Adobe bricks for people who didn't make their own was Mel Medina, who had what I think was the world's largest Adobe production yard. If he pushed really hard, he could make 25,000, but a more normal day was around 12,000 Adobe bricks per day. A lot of machines, and it was a well orchestrated system. And Mel passed away 2 years ago in September, and the family has not chosen to reopen. And so northern New Mexico is now quite worried about where, particularly a year ago, quite worried about where they're going to get bricks for their projects. What's happened is I thought it would. People with small operations have started up in various places. Adobe bricks will be there, but it just, you have to go looking for them a little bit more than if they don't sit on pallets down at Lowe's building supply.
Right.
So it's another thing for anybody out there who's an entrepreneur, make Adobe bricks, work out a deal with Lowe's, and then, like all the other materials, there should be a bunch of pallets with Adobe bricks on them outside every Lowe's and Home Depot. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I love that you have, some calls to action for listeners. And it sounds like that you have a couple of core messages that you like to get out, one being, more guys get involved in Adobe, another being anybody can do it. It's very accessible. Is there anything else that's like a core message after all these years that you've been teaching that you really want to make sure that people know about Adobe construction?
Wow, that's a tough question. Anybody can do it. The materials are there. Nobody's holding you back. The Bible would have had to been changed if they'd paid attention to me, because they didn't need straw. They could have made perfectly good Adobe bricks with clay and sand. So if they'd just gone up the wadi and brought back some sand down to mix with their clay and silt along the Nile, they could have made perfectly fine Adobes, and they would not have had to be in thrall to Pharaoh. At one point when I was building, we did have a problem, and that was there was some rebar came up from Mexico that they were recycling metal. Somebody recycled a dental X-ray thing, and we had radioactive rebar.
Oh my gosh!
So for a while, rebar was shut down, and you had to make sure your rebar was okay, or take it out of the foundation, which was no fun. And then there was another time when there was a cement shortage, right around 1973. And we'd been getting a lot of cement from Mexico, and that was cut off, and we couldn't find cement. And then there was another time when gypsum plaster was hard to get. So I'm saying now, here along comes the death of Mel Medina. We had never experienced a shortage of Adobe, but without Mel being around, people can go out and make their own Adobe bricks. It is hard work, but a lot of people do that. One of my heroes does business as Adobe Palaces, and whenever he can, he makes the Adobe bricks on the site of where he's building. That's Ernest Aragon. So we're not totally dependent, that we have ways to get around it. And so the government can't hold you back. They couldn't hold back my father-in-law for using war critical materials. And so you're out from under the thumb of outside
Supply chains.
Thank you. And what I did want to say, I think we're at a point where after all these decades, we're going to see another wave of earthen materials becoming very popular, because people are all of a sudden starting to use all of the words. It's green, it's environmentally correct, it's we put this all together. Every time we turn around, some other organization has suddenly, Adobe, we're pretty sure that it's at the bottom of the scale for the amount of embodied energy that goes into making an Adobe, particularly if you do it yourself. It's your own metabolic metabolism that makes the brick. It actually is formed as the sun hits it, so it's solar energy dries it out. And beyond that, the only other energy inputs, but they can be significant, are picking it up, putting it on a truck, moving it somewhere, or if you've made it yourself, picking it up and putting it on the wall. But we're largely outside this big chain of consumerism that everybody keeps adding on a little bit to the price. Everybody keeps adding on a little bit to the amount of carbon that we're producing one way or another. And so I'll be quick here. We're getting close to almost my conclusion. For instance, the Arabs are planning to make, or have made, or somewhere along the way, 150 million Adobe bricks to rebuild the city of Al Diriyah. It's a big project, the Diriyah Gate. And this was the original capital of Saudi Arabia. It got bombed to smithereens in World War I, and now they're rebuilding part of it to the way it used to be, part of it to the way it was after it got bombed to smithereens, and part of it they're building it or they're preserving what exists right now. They'll have a whole city that goes along with this. It's going to be a major tourist thing. So 150 million. Here, I just told you that Mel Medina, the world's largest producer, could make 25,000 when he was pressed. You divide 25,000 into 150 million. That's a really long time. Solving the problem are the folks in India. And I don't know how they slipped this over on me, because it's been going on for 5 or 6 years, and I hadn't noticed it until sometime this spring. In India, they're making a whole new kind of machine to make Adobe bricks on the ground to be sun cured. And it's a big wheel.
Mm.
And the wheel is like a ladder form that somebody has bent into a circle. It rolls along. It injects mud at one point. As it hits the ground, it leaves adobes. And these people can make, I thought they could make 85,000 bricks with one of these machines in one day. A friend of mine who has seen one says, well, we push it and we get 105,000 adobe bricks. So the point is, here are the Saudis with a massive project, and suddenly the folks in India are coming up with a solution. India has always suffered from people having bad feelings towards Adobe and Earth, as that's where the poor people live. That's where the unmentionables, the untouchables, oh, that's not for us. Well, if they're going to make these machines that can make all of these Adobe bricks, they're going to be making lots of, and you see these people on the internet with their lab coats on and their professional engineers. It's going to give a whole new feeling, I think, in India, I hope, towards the use of Adobe. Same thing's going on in China. The Chinese government, from top down, is trying to encourage people to get out of the cities and live in the rural areas, and they're doing all kinds of things in rural areas, one of which is going to be encourage Adobe construction. So that's three things. One more, four. There are plans to house, it's either 300,000 homes or 300,000 people will be housed in Syria. If the shooting ever stops, there's a plan, and it'll be backed initially by the Saudis to do relocation homes for people. So when we see all of that going on, I can't help but think that we're on the cusp of entering a new era where people are going to pay a lot more attention to Adobe.
Well, luckily, it's already in the code, as we talked about earlier. So it's not like the whole building industry has to navigate uncharted waters. Mm-hmm. It's just they have to recenter themselves in a different technique that maybe makes more sense, though it does kind of counteract or work against our, consumer centric and, capitalistic system of, centralized production and distribution networks and whatever. So it'll take a, sort of grassroots demand for mm-hmm. people to be, kind of coming back to that. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because I wanted for listeners to be aware that, hey, there is a way you could build your own house, and mm-hmm. you could do it out of the earth, and you could create a structure that was a lot more sustainable, a lot more comfortable, a lot more in tune with the natural cycles of the earth and heating and cooling. And you could yourself create a house that was more in line with nature. And you don't have to wait for someone to show up, with the fancy, new technique that's manufactured in China. You can actually build it out of the earth that you're standing on. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a really important message for people who have been disconnected from our traditional ways of doing things or our natural ways of doing things, is to bring that back to their awareness.
Well, and that's a good point. I thank you. And well, I would say that this house, it was an old house and abandoned and pretty bad shape. We got it at a very cheap price. And then I did everything cash out of pocket. But when I did do the roof, I got a bank loan, and it took me several years to pay that off, and that wasn't fun. But primarily, the bulk of this house has been either renovated or built from scratch, cash out of pocket. And it's very easy with Adobe to make an addition. And probably the 4 rooms that are here in a line were done one at a time by previous occupants. Somebody would say, I need a little more space, and they'd add another room. Yeah. And you can pre-plan additions to a house, to any house, but you can also not have pre-planned and just decide at some point you want to add a room. And it's fairly easy with Adobe to make openings for doors and windows. Mm-hmm. And so it's a nice kind of way to build if you're not doing it all at once, to do the drawn out lifetime house. And that's where I am. Someday I'm going to finish it, maybe.
Well, Quentin, thank you so much for all of the experience and wisdom and good ideas that you shared with us today. I'm going to obviously put Adobe in Action, the Mud Talks podcast, as links in the show notes. Is there any other resources that you want to make sure that we let listeners know about in terms of where to go for information about how to get started?
Well, I think between the Earth Builders Guild and Adobe in Action, we cover quite a bit. There is a discussion group that we're trying to, we had quite a few people on a Yahoo group, and we were trying to bring it back as AO. And I'm sorry that I can't. You'd think I'd have that on the tip of my tongue, but it's at the IO. I think it's just Adobe at IO, and we're trying to turn that back into the powerhouse discussion group that had been before Yahoo pulled out their discussion groups, and we lost it. So anyway, there's that. There are just amazing resources, as I had mentioned earlier, with some of the codes from other countries, and that would be New Zealand and Australia, that I think are outstanding. And other than that, I can't come up with right at the moment with any great. I'm just amazed when I hear from people some of the things they've discovered. Well, it's like I'd never heard about these giant machines that can make the thousands of Adobes. Yeah. That was sprung on me by a person who'd called me up. So the internet now has this almost infinite, indefatigable supply of information. And what I want to say is that if you don't have all the information, you can figure it out. Adobe reveals itself to you. It doesn't let you do things that you can't. You might have to do something twice. It's rare that walls fall over. But if a person just gets out there every day, shovel and trowel, pretty soon they'll have a house, because billions of people have built Adobe houses. I don't know how they did it. They never called me, but they just figured it out and asked their grandmother. I'll end up on the grandmother note.
Wonderful. Well, Quentin, thank you again so much.
You're welcome, Laura. It's a pleasure.
Hey, thank you for taking the time to listen to Less House More Moola. I have another free resource on my website for you, the Unconventional Values Quiz. In just 2 minutes, you can pinpoint your style of freedom seeker, security guardian, adventure enthusiast, or community builder. Check it out at thetinyhouseadvisor.com. And one more thing. Podcasts don't have algorithms like social media does. They only grow by word of mouth and reviews. If this podcast is helpful to you, would you please post a review on your podcast app and tell a friend who is trying to live a values-based life? It would totally make my day.
Please see the show notes for important disclosure regarding the Tiny House Advisor LLC and this episode.